the best way to overcome limerence is not just to change your thoughts, but to also reduce your interactions with the LO. One of the most disorienting things about limerence is the fact that you cannot trust your own judgments. You can't trust what you see, what you believe, what you think is happening between you and the other person. And you obviously cannot trust your own feelings. Today, we are going to talk about this very serious condition that is still being under research. We're going to look at a research paper that I believe comes close to providing evidence-based methods that will allow us to alleviate some of the negative symptoms that comes with experiencing limerence. This is one of my highly requested videos, so I know that there are many of you who are ready to reclaim your reality. But I think that this could be helpful for those of you who are still on the fence about whether or not you are actually experiencing limerence. Let me share this about myself. When I was experiencing limerence, I'd click a video like this out of curiosity, how to get over the LO, go no contact or whatever, but I wouldn't really take in the fact that maybe I needed help. When you're at the height of it, it's hard to see the negative impact it has on you. So you can go to the description in the link, take a quiz and see, am I even experiencing limerence? I can't convince you to overcome limerence or any addiction that you're in the sweet and high stages of. You have to see it as a problem. Can't guarantee that it's going to make your life easier. In fact, it might make your life a little harder for a while. Can guarantee you that if you decide to recover from limerence, love addiction, codependency, you will grow from it. You will absolutely grow from it. The link is in the description if you want to take that quiz to see if you are in fact limerent or if it's having a negative impact on your life. If you're new here, my name is Adele. I am a licensed psychotherapist, and we talk about all things limerence and other relationship issues. For a long time, many of you have been asking for actual methods on how to heal from limerence, so I put together a workbook that I included in the description, and we're going to be covering some part of that workbook today. If you like what you watch, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more, comment, and let me know what had been successful for you when you were recovering from limerence. If you're still in it, what isn't working? And even though I'm a therapist, this isn't medical advice. A lot of this comes from the research papers that I will be reviewing and also my own personal experience. That being said, therapy is really, really important in this process. The workbook and myself does not replace the therapeutic process. Definitely seek out a professional if you are in crisis. Now that's aside, let's dive deep. I like to give context to the information that I'm sharing, why it's so important to have a specific treatment protocol for limerence. The number one question that people have is, how is limerence any different than romantic love or the early stages of falling in love? And that's a great question because there is a distinction and there are some overlaps in the symptoms. Here's what we know so far. There are no current distinctions when it comes to romantic love and limerence, at least insofar as we can see from brain scans. Also, the crystallization phase of limerence, where you start to see all the positive things about the person that you're attracted to and start to fixate on this person, that's the crystallization phase, which I talk about in another video here. Interestingly, unlike the development of a romantic relationship, sexual attraction doesn't have to be present with a limerent episode. You can just deeply admire this person and obsess about them, even if they're the gender or person that you wouldn't be attracted to. So that's a pretty big distinction. Another distinction between limerence and the early stages of romantic love is how debilitating it becomes. Romantic love goes through a cycle where the real relationship starts to begin. You start to see the person for who they are. But in limerence, you stay suspended in that state of fantasy because limerence is primarily a fantasy-based attachment that we project onto the LO, the object of affection. We do not see them as their own separate person, despite the fact that we believe or that we perceive that we do. Both romantic love and limerence happens involuntarily, meaning that you can't really choose who you fall for. But limerent thoughts, unlike romantic love, becomes intrusive, meaning that they are out of control. They start to consume your mind. They take over any other primary need that you have: eating, sleeping, studying, focusing on other relationships in your life, even basic self-care. Let's transition now into addictions and the addictive components of limerence. Researcher Watkins and Vo proposed a model of limerence based on Tenov's original work, which drew parallels between two mental health conditions known as behavioral addictions and obsessive compulsive disorder. Let's start with talking about addictions. There are a lot of things that we can be attached to or addicted to, and people use it very loosely. The main question that you want to ask is, how debilitating is this relationship to this thing in your life? Are you missing deadlines? Are you not seeing friends? Are you isolating? Are you spending hours of your time ruminating on fantasies about this person? And this is a very oversimplified way to say this, but the brain scans show that the feelings of intense romantic love involve the regions of the brain that we refer to as the reward center, and that we see with other behavioral addictions such as video games, gambling, shopping, etc. Like any behavioral addiction, the intensity and the duration of a limerent episode varies from person to person. So this spectrum of limerence can be anywhere from an office crush that becomes too distracting, or having fantasies about leaving your spouse, to actually leaving your spouse, to not even knowing the person or having any interactions with them like a celebrity. So we are moving towards erotomania, where we are moving farther away from reality, and we might have more of a baby reindeer stalker situation here. That's the far end of the psychopathology spectrum. But what all of these different varieties of limerent episodes have in common is that there is an aspect of it that is uncontrollable and removed from reality to some extent. I want to get into that in another video, but essentially, there are some plausibilities in the fantasies that people have, even of celebrities that they have a crush on. There is an aspect of it that is built on pieces of reality. Basically, some parts of it are imagined and some parts of it are actually taking place. In the context of limerence, there are intrusive thoughts and compulsive rituals that run parallel to another mental health condition known as obsessive compulsive disorder. Watkins and Vo, who discovered this connection, found that the separation from the LO is what caused severe anxiety. Very similar to withdrawal symptoms that someone experiences in any behavioral addiction. But when they don't have that object of affection, that object, that drug of choice, then there are going to be withdrawal symptoms such as sleep disturbances, pain in the chest or in the stomach, irritability, and depression. Now, the OCD-like symptoms in limerence are the intrusive thoughts, the fantasies, and the ruminations about the way that the other person feels about you or how you come off to the other person. It is centered around the desire for reciprocation or for feelings to be returned. According to Tenov, these daydreams can consist of obsessions that have to do with previous interactions that you've had with them or imagined interactions that you would have with them in the future. So trying to plan that out, or an oversensitivity to picking apart hidden meaning. But unlike your typical OCD, where uncertainty is the intolerable factor, limerence is driven by uncertainty. It intensifies when you don't know how the other person feels about you, mixed with a little bit of hope that there is, again, that possibility. Internal preoccupations that one has are typically if-then statements. These are called conditional assumptions. How we interact with the LO. So if we say something like, If they look in my direction, then that means they like me. If I sit closer to them, then it will allow me to have an interaction with them. If I am available to the LO at all times, they will see me more favorably, or they will see me as more desirable. These kinds of conditional assumption overrides our behaviors. And on top of that, it increases our sensitivity to these interactions that we have with them, further increasing our misperceptions of our relationship to them. In other words, we start making connections to hidden meaning that likely not taking place. But because we are experiencing such strong, obsessive thoughts about them, the logical conclusion is that there is some sort of relevance to these mental compulsions, when in fact it is our minds just firing away, over-interpreting and overvaluing the relationship. Watkins and Vo found that limerent sufferers would experience this intense shame around their desire, so much so that they would place greater importance to the relationship that they had. This means that they would justify their obsession, and it would further intensify their need to get emotional reciprocation. Those limerent compulsions, those mental obsessions, would feed into the rituals of reaching out and having more interactions with the LO. I've expanded a little bit on this research, not with a model that I created, but one that is very common when we look at the obsessive cycle. But we are applying that to limerence and seeing how this limerent compulsion feeds into the rituals and how it further solidifies this addiction. I provide that in that workbook as well. There's this constant balancing act when it comes to limerence, which is avoiding actual rejection, but also avoiding any sense of distancing between them and the LO. This is why many people who are in this episode of limerence walk by this person's workplace or bring them up in conversations or are constantly making associations with the limerent object. They start to think of their favorite restaurant, their favorite music. Their brain just continues to make these connections about the other person as a way to remain close to them, because separation from the limerent object makes them so anxious. And whenever they give into these different compulsions to bring them up in conversation or to walk by their favorite restaurant, it actually feeds into those intense feelings of connection. And at the same time, there is this balancing act of not really moving towards any true knowing where you stand between you and the LO, because this avoidance of being rejected. If you brought to light the intense feelings that you have from the other person, you know that there is some sort of disconnect that you might experience and would have to contend with. Like any obsessive compulsive disorder, the compulsion only alleviates the distressing thoughts and emotions temporarily. Testing for returned feelings will not bring you clarity or a peace of mind. There's a stuckness about limerence, and why it is a unique condition that is a combination of OCD and not OCD at all, and addictions, but not addictions at all. So much so that it requires a complex diagnostic tool to be able to treat such a complex condition, such as limerence. In the absence of a diagnostic criteria and a treatment protocol for limerence, William and Bentley's more recent work have utilized the most effective treatment for other disorders such as OCD, which is exposure response prevention. We're going to look at that in a later video, and I split this particular workbook up into 3 parts. The first one that I'm going to be releasing will be on the case conceptualization and the cognitive beliefs and assumptions. And then the second part will be on the ERP, or exposure response prevention, and cognitive restructuring. And the third one will be on behavioral activation. All of those different techniques yielded positive results for addictions and obsessive compulsive disorder. So in that way, it could be useful for limerence. We are going to look at the case conceptualization that you can make of yourself. I'm going to provide you guys an example of how I would fill this out to see how limerence is maintained in your mind and how you might want to go about reprogramming this particular automatic thought process. All of those resources are free in the link below. This case conceptualization model allows us to see our inner workings of our own thoughts and beliefs and behaviors that maintains this limerent episode. We will be looking at BW's, which is the author of this research paper, and the ways that she filled it out. That example is also provided in the workbook. You can skip this part if you want to go straight into the workable demos, but I always suggest looking at this research paper so that you can see the limitations and also understand the context behind this work. So the researcher, BW, compiled this data from her own experience over a period of 7 weeks, from August to September 2016. They followed up with a self-monitoring form 9 months following the initial administration prior to the intervention. In the first session, they used the baseline measure of their limerent rituals, which were collected from a 2-week period utilizing a form developed for the treatment of OCD. This is collected in session 1. The baseline measure allows us to see the progress over time and see in the long run if it was an effective treatment. What do we see in this baseline measure? So we see that BW, the author, engaged in 8 hours of overt rituals like rumination, fantasizing about the other person, and 30 to 90 minutes per day. That's something you might want to collect on average to see how often you engage in rituals. Let's get into talking about the limitations of the study. So we know that BW, the author of this particular study, was self-diagnosing and self-reporting. So that can create a bias about whether or not they even have limerence and possible placebo about their progress that they made. And a really big limitation is that this is a single case study. Any significant research should be replicated, or else it can create some biased outcomes. Anytime we're making a case conceptualization, we always want to get some demographic information. BW at the time was a 28-year-old cisgender white female, and she began psychotherapy for limerence in March of 2016. She would follow up with treatment every 2 weeks. She had a lifelong pattern of limerence. Sometimes she would even have a romantic partner during the time when she was experiencing limerence over someone else. Usually her limerence had no sexual desire attached to it. Her desire was to be emotionally and physically close to this person, and it usually was a female. Since the age of 4, she would experience this pattern of being drawn to females in mentoring roles, like camp counselors or teachers. Tenov would refer to this as the hero complex. In therapy, we always collect the presenting complaint. These are the disturbances. What brings this person here in therapy? As for many of you guys, it is limerence, but how does it present? How is it causing problems in her life? Well, like we said, she had spent a lot of time ruminating on these LOs. In college, it became extremely debilitating for her because it started to impact her academic performance because of the fact that she was consistently fixated on this LO. What did her compulsions like? Well, the typical. She would bring them up in conversations. She would walk by places that she saw them, not as a way of stalking them, but as a way of feeling close to them. And she felt she needed to know where they were at all times. Among those ruminations and compulsions, she would also experience mood swings from euphoria to depression depending on a previous interaction she would have with the LO. If it went well, she would be elated, and if it went negatively, she would experience extreme depression. Now for the workable demos. So this case conceptualization, which I provide in the description, is something you can fill out alongside the different core beliefs and the conditional assumptions that I've also included in this workbook. If you can't think of your own, these are common core beliefs and conditional assumptions that someone might have if they experience limerence. This diagram reveals how limerence develops and how it's maintained over time. It also gives us some insight on how someone can go about reprogramming their limerent mind. This is not something that BW or I made up. This is adapted from Beck's cognitive approach, founder of cognitive behavior therapy. What makes cognitive behavior therapy a really powerful tool is that you can work directly with these different internal scripts, which is what feeds the limerence and what maintains it. I normally come from a background of object relations theory and psychoanalytic theory. What they have in common here is that our core beliefs that we have come from our early experiences. Now, we won't get into the attachments that we had with our early caregivers like we would in psychoanalytic therapy or object relations therapy, but what we will talk about is the core beliefs or the scripts, also known as schemas. These schemas become the basis of how we view ourselves, how we view others, and the world. This is how we interact with the LO on the beliefs that we adopted. Again, these core beliefs become the basis for how we process and interpret new information. In limerence, this information becomes a fixation on, are they reciprocating my feelings or not? And how well am I presenting myself to the LO? In this example from the research, BW believed that she wasn't as good as others, or that I would lose control if I'm too vulnerable. Those were her core beliefs. I included a list of the 3 main themes in core beliefs that people have, and ones that are very common perhaps in limerence, and of the beliefs that I listed here, but just in case you can't think of any, I included that as well. As for the conditional beliefs or assumptions, you kind of think of them as reflexes, mental reflexes. They are intermediate beliefs that we automatically assume to alleviate ourselves from the negative core beliefs. In limerence, these conditional beliefs, like I must be loved to feel worthy, fuels the obsessive thoughts and emotional dependency. BW, in her particular case of limerence, had the conditional assumption that my needs won't be met in relationships, or if I get too close to someone, I will overwhelm them, which made her limerent on a person who was, of course, unavailable, and an unbinding relationship, which would serve as a way for her to be intimate without being overwhelming to someone, or without being disappointed that they won't meet her needs. These kinds of conditional assumptions are ones that kind of trap us into moving towards limerent attachments. So avoiding intimacy maintains control and overcompensate for the lack of intimacy by seeking approval and recognition from non-binding relationships. That's what BW would do, and that's what many folks do when they are in limerence. As 10 off notes, your degree of involvement increases if obstacles are externally imposed or if you doubt LO's feelings for you. That tells you that the limerent reaction that you have can be caused by real or imagined proximity to the LO. So this can be taking place in your head or outside of your head, but in any case, they either increase the uncertainty or your sensitivity to these interactions with the LO, further keeping you stuck in this pattern of obsession. You either move towards the LO to see if your feelings are returned, if you're doubting them, or you move towards them because you are hopeful that they are being returned. It's a double-edged sword. The bottom half of this diagram is the obsessive cycle. Oftentimes people think that to cope with this anxious attachment they have to the LO is to engage in such behaviors like these rituals, to get close to them or to check on their social media or to bring them up in conversations or analyze them in their head. But with any obsessive compulsive disorder, that only brings temporary relief. It can bring a sense of ecstasy, a sense of reassurance, and other times it brings a sense of guilt or self-loathing. And then the cycle begins again. It's apparent that, like obsessive compulsive disorder and addictions, when you utilize one method of coping, which is the LO, seeing if the other person is interested in you, being close to them, fantasizing about them as your coping mechanism, you are going to grow attached and addicted to being in relationship with this fantasy version of your relationship. In part 2 and 3, we will talk about more adaptive habits that can contradict previously held beliefs. And then we are also going to talk about cognitive restructuring, which can help you challenge some of the irrational beliefs. But I did include a basic start to identifying a core belief and to reframing it. Instructions for reframing it are in the packet. So an example would be this core belief that I need their attention to feel worthy of love. The theme that this person is experiencing in their negative core belief is unlovability. To reframe this, ideally something more positive, but it's hard to jump from a negative belief to a really positive belief. So if we keep it neutral, it might be more accessible. So instead of I need their attention to feel worthy of love, you might say my worth is not dependent on anyone's attention or approval. And then to practice this neutral thinking, you want to reflect on how it feels, how to continue to shift your focus. I like to use this shortcut to remembering how to cognitively reconstruct your automatic limerent thoughts, which is the 3 C's. There is catch it, check it, and change it. Catch it, because these thoughts are happening so automatically, you want to be able to catch when they're happening. Check it. Is this thought a negative belief that is coming from the anxiety or the distress? Or am I overanalyzing it? And then 3, change it. What can I replace this thought with that's more neutral or would serve me better? So that is a little bit of the workable aspects, how to deprogram your attachment to the limerent object. The findings of this study showed that exposure response prevention, cognitive restructuring, and behavioral activation techniques were effective in reducing the frequency and the number of compulsions, as well as the distorted beliefs in the individual with limerence. This is something you can test out for yourself, and like I said before, this is a single study case. So this is something that worked for the author and something that could work for you if you stay consistent with it and if you manage to reframe not just the way that you're thinking about it, and by reducing the actions and rituals that you're engaging in which feed into the limerent addiction. Some of my closing thoughts are on perception and how in limerence and in romantic love we are wearing these rose-colored lenses that influences how much focus we put on the other person, how we remember interactions, and how we interpret them. And ultimately, our perceptions influence the ways that we act towards the LO. I will say this, from my own personal experience, the best way to overcome limerence is not just to change your thoughts, but to also reduce your interactions with the LO. Reducing your interactions with them so that there isn't a lot of content for your mind to overanalyze and obsess about. This isn't an option that everybody has, and the author of this research study actually was not willing to change her work situation, so she had to reduce the number of compulsions that she would engage in. Quickest way that I believe one can overcome their limerent addiction, which is by reducing contact with the LO or reducing the compulsions that they engage in both mentally and physically. If you liked what you watched, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments what has worked for you. Stay tuned for part 2.